What's happening, everybody? On today's show, some spring football tidbits from Alabama, Georgia, and LSU. Some football news at Mizzou, Auburn, and Tennessee. Who have been the biggest spenders in recruiting so far? And the latest on some basketball players and the transfer portal across the SEC. Locked on SEC starts now.
You are Locked On SEC, your daily podcast on the Southeastern Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And what's happening, everybody? Welcome into Locked On SEC. It's great to have you guys along. I'm Chris Gordy. Thanks for making us your first listen every day. And remember, Locked On SEC is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube and at lockedonsec.com. Let's jump into it. Let's go around the conference.
Boots out to the right. Intercepted. Takes the handoff. What a catch.
Around the conference.
We start over at Alabama as new offensive coordinator Tommy Rees having a good early impression on his offensive weapons. Alabama wide receiver Ja'Cory Brooks talking with the media this week, and he talked about the new OC, who's a little bit younger. He will turn 31 next month. Tommy Rees will, and much younger than the 53-year-old Bill O'Brien, who just departed back for the NFL. But Ja'Cory Brooks was asked about Tommy Rees, and he said, I wouldn't say too much is new, but there is a lot different. I would say Tommy Rees is more young, got a little bit more swag. Swag, probably not a word that was used to describe Bill O'Brien at any point, but Tommy Rees, obviously closer to these guys' age, played quarterback spot in college not too long ago, and obviously looking to build off of last season's success. Bryce Young, of course, is gone. Ja'Cory Brooks looking to build off of his season last year where he had 670 yards receiving and 8 touchdowns. He was asked about the quarterbacks, Jalen Milroe and Ty Simpson. Didn't really say much on them, just said they're competing and working hard and getting the job done. Brooks did single out one standout. He said JUCO transfer Malik Benson. He said, I've been loving his energy since he came in for the bowl game. He's been coming in, working, and bringing all that positive energy. So Malik Benson may be a guy to watch for the Tide this fall. But Ja'Cory Brooks, excited about Tommy Rees. We'll see if he brings some dynamic play calling to that offense, whoever the quarterback ends up being. One more Alabama note, D lineman Justin Boygby shared some good news on Monday. He missed most of last season due to injury. He tweeted out he is 100% healed and cleared from that neck injury that sidelined him for much of last year. Played in just the first 4 games of Alabama's season last year. Nick Saban said back in October that he had a procedure to address a neck injury. This year will be Boygby's 5th season in Tuscaloosa. He'll be considered a redshirt senior. And over 4 seasons, he's played in 42 games for the Tide, recording 59 tackles, 4.5 tackles for a loss, and 2 sacks. So we will see what he is able to do this season. By the way, Alabama's spring game, the 8A, set for April 22nd. Over at Georgia, we heard from their quarterbacks meeting with the media this week, Carson Beck and Brock Vandagriff, as they're battling this out for the starting quarterback job, counting down to Georgia's spring game coming up. And Carson Beck, projected by many to be the favorite to win the job. He talked about new offensive coordinator Mike Bobo and the early impact that he has had on not just his development, but the whole quarterback room, which obviously is replacing, Stetson Bennett gone. They've got some new faces in there. So Mike Bobo, he said, having him as a coordinator has been really good, Carson Beck said. He said, obviously, him playing the position, playing here, he knows what we're going through. He connects and relates to us on that level because he's done it before. He's really positive, does a really good job with the offense, rallying guys, getting guys ready for practice. Really excited to keep working with him and see how it goes. Meanwhile, Brock Vandagriff was asked about Mike Bobo, and he said he's pretty intense. He said on the first day he came into the quarterback room and said, I'm going to coach you guys hard. I hope you're open to that. We didn't really have a choice on if we would be okay with that. We just said, yes, sir. And he's been really good. The way he's been coaching us up, he has a reason for everything he does, and his meetings go really well. So going to be interesting to see, again, who wins the battle, but a lot of people expected Carson Beck will eventually be named Georgia's starter. By the way, they opened the season September 2nd against Tennessee Martin. Over at LSU, defensive coordinator Matt House spoke with the media this week and talked about what he's liked and what he's seen from his star defensive linebacker, Harold Perkins, playing that star linebacker spot. And defensive coordinator said, look, he's got a better understanding of our process and how we prepare. His habits have been much more consistent. He loves football, is very coachable. Perkins had 7.5 sacks last year. He went on to say, we know Harold has elite ability, but he came here to learn linebacker, still playing outside some, but he is here to be a complete linebacker. There was some thought, maybe he could play a little edge and rush the passer, but they are keeping him at linebacker. They think he's a true sideline to sideline backer, can also cover tight ends and such down the field. So excited to see what Harold Perkins does next year for LSU. In other news, Matt House was asked about any other defenders standing out. He mentioned Sage Ryan starting at the nickel spot this spring. He said he's still got a lot of room for growth, but he has been more consistent. And on the D-line, Matt House talked about getting Mason Smith back with Mekhi Wingo. He said it's an opportunity to see what these guys can do. Pleased with Jacoby and Guillory's growth and others. We expect to have a really good defensive line, so keep an eye on that for LSU. Meanwhile, over in Gainesville, where Billy Napier and company are gearing up for year 2, they have added a major recruit to their 2025 recruiting class. They just picked up a commit from 4-star quarterback Austin Simmons this week. Again, this is for the 2025 class, so 2 years from now, but he's the number 6 passer in the country for that class, number 56 overall player. So a big-time get there for Billy Napier and the Gators. First commitment for the class of 2025. Florida also set a date for their homecoming this week. Florida will hold their homecoming festivities in Gainesville the week of October 7th when they host Vanderbilt. For the first time since 2014, Vanderbilt will be a revenge game for the Gators. Commodores beat Florida 31-24 in Nashville last year for just their second win over the Gators since 1989. Vanderbilt loss was the start of that 3-game losing skid where Billy Napier and company kind of stumbled to the finish line. But Florida season, it will begin on Thursday, August 31st. That'll be at Utah, taking on the defending Pac-12 champion. And Florida will hold their annual spring scrimmage next week, a week from Thursday, the orange and blue game. That'll be in prime time on SEC Network Plus. Over at Missouri, Eli Drinkwitz announced on Wednesday that Brandon Jones will be the Tigers' new offensive line coach. 15-plus year veteran of the coaching industry, has worked on the staffs of guys like Dana Holgerson, Cliff Kingsbury, Lincoln Riley, Sonny Dykes, was a standout center at Texas Tech in the mid-2000s. Jones will replace Marcus Johnson, who left for Purdue. Drinkwitz said Brandon and his O-line units have been a major factor in a number of high-powered offenses over the past decade. Adding a veteran with Brandon's background will be a tremendous asset. So Brandon Jones, the new O-line coach for Missouri. By the way, 6 of Jones's former players currently in the NFL playing on offensive lines. So a good pedigree there. Over at Tennessee, they are still having to deal with the ramifications of Jeremy Pruitt and all that stuff. The NCAA, they've scheduled a contested hearing in the case against Jeremy Pruitt and Derek Ansley. There will be 3 parties represented at the hearing. School officials, NCAA officials, and the former Tennessee coaches are set to meet for a 3-day hearing April 19th through the 21st in Cincinnati, according to Sports Illustrated. The school was accused of handing out $60,000 worth of impermissible benefits. They were given, the coaches were given show causes ranging from 3 to 5 years by the NCAA. And most Florida folks, including Josh Heupel, ready to just put this thing in the past and put it behind them. One more note over at Auburn. Hugh Freeze made some headlines this week where he talked about the idea of playing some FCS opponents instead of a traditional spring game. And he mentioned schools like UAB, Troy, and Alabama State being in-state opponents that maybe they could play. Trent Dilfer, who's the new head coach at UAB, was asked about it this week, and he said, pretty pleased. Yes, of course. Hugh Freeze is right. I think we all want, whether you're Auburn or Alabama, you're looking for live competition. You're looking not to play yourself every day. I think if you're UAB or Troy, you're looking to hopefully play people that are perceived to be much better than you So you can kind of use that as a test to see where your program's at. So look, fans seem to be on board with the idea. There's been talk, it could be a fundraiser. You could raise money for the programs and all that. Obviously, you don't want to risk injury, but look, if you're going hard up against each other every day in practice, Bama good on good, why not? Instead of having a spring game playing yourself, bring in another opponent. And, maybe that could replace the cupcake games you play in the fall. But I think Hugh Freeze is on to something there, but we'll see, injuries and all the other ramifications of that if that will ever happen. And one more note as we continue going on around the conference over at South Carolina. They are hosting former Florida State defensive lineman Derek McClendon on a visit this week. According to On3 Sports, McClendon started 12 games for the Noles last year, but decided to enter the transfer portal. He's in the portal as a grad transfer, so he's able to maintain his eligibility, even though he's transferring. Recorded 7 sacks for the Noles over the past 2 seasons, was a primary starter for Florida State last year. And Gamecocks are looking for some pass rush help, so that would be tremendous if they could get him. We'll keep an eye on Derek McClendon if he winds up over there at South Carolina. And there you have it. That's the latest news going on around the conference. Coming up next, we'll talk about a 24/7 sports article on who's spending the most in recruiting. A lot of SEC schools on that list. We'll talk about that in just a second. But first, this episode is presented to you by our friends over at FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are almost here, and it is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. The new customers, if you're a new customer, you sign up, you get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. So just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. You can bet on everything they got, from the money line to points scored, three-pointers drained, in-game live betting. They've got it all up there for you. And FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. So don't miss your chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. By the way, we've got some golf happening this weekend as well if you want to get in on that. All of it is up there on the FanDuel app. Go check them out, FanDuel. All right, roll along here, Locked On SEC, and I found this article really interesting. Brad Crawford does a great job over there at 24/7 Sports, as a lot of the guys do over there. And Brad wrote an article this week, talking about college football recruiting. And he ran through the numbers on some of the biggest spenders in 2023 for the 2023 recruiting class. And he said, look, recruiting at an elite level in college football breeds success. According to documents that were obtained by USA Today across multiple recruiting cycles, college football's biggest spenders last year broke the bank for official visits, cross-country trips, and other factors in acquiring their talent. Per USA Today, the minimum threshold of spending on recruiting is $1.6 million, which is where the gap begins. The transfer portal also, has contributed a big factor for this, but he said, let's look at which college football programs spend the most money on recruiting during this past 2023 recruiting cycle. I'll just tell you this. He put the top 10. Only 3 schools in here are non-SEC current or future teams. All the rest are SEC teams. So we'll touch on the ones that are in here. First up, we start with the Florida Gators. They come in at number 10 on this list. And he says spending on their 2023 recruiting was $1.6 million. Florida has provided a great deal of resources to Billy Napier in recruiting. That's an element he didn't have during his run at ULL. But a top 15 signing class was overshadowed by the NIL debacle involving Jaden Rashada, the quarterback, who was granted his release after rumored broken promises. Florida currently holds the 10th best class nationally for 2024, and we'll see if he can build on that. But Florida spent a lot of money on recruiting resources, and they come in number 10 on this list. Number 9 and number 8 were Oregon and Michigan, so we won't get into them, non-SEC schools. But how about number 7? It's Alabama, maybe a little bit lower on this list than you might have thought. But they're spending on this past year's recruiting class $2.3 million. It says ranked second on last year's list of college football's biggest spenders was the Crimson Tide, who scaled back their helicopter rides to recruits and other ventures this time around. based on Alabama signing the nation's top-ranked recruiting class, it was money well spent. For the 10th time since 2011, the Crimson Tide finished number 1 in the composite recruiting rankings, and they wrapped up what is their second-best class ever. For historical comparison, Alabama's 2023 group would rank number 3 all-time, but behind A&M's 2022 class and Alabama's 2021 class. So they're doing it the right way. Not even spending the most money, and yet they had the best class. Another one that makes this list, it's the Texas Longhorns. They spent just a little bit more than Alabama, $2.4 million. We're only mentioning them because they're a future SEC team, and so Texas will have no issues with its transition into the SEC as a top recruiter, evidenced by Steve Sarkisian putting together the past few classes that he does in his early tenure with the Longhorns. Of course, big headliner in here was Arch Manning. There was a report that came out earlier this year that they spent $280,000 alone on Arch Manning and other recruits coming in for an official visit last June. They had cakes and food and all kinds of stuff. And some people just said it was the cost of doing business. And it apparently was worth it because they ended up getting Arch Manning. And we'll see if he ends up being the future heir apparent there at quarterback for Texas. Coming at number 5 on this list, another future SEC team. It's the Oklahoma Sooners. They spent $2.6 million. And Brad Crawford writes that Brent Venables' first full recruiting cycle was a terrific effort despite a lackluster season on the field. Not only did Oklahoma manage several late-game flips in their 2023 class, but the Sooners managed to sign several high-end transfers as well. All of that resulted in the nation's 6th best class. So well worth the money for there. Now Venables just has to prove it on the field. All right, back to current SEC teams. How about the Tennessee Volunteers coming at number 4 on this list? They were estimated to spend around $2.9 million on this past year's recruiting class. And when I say we're spending on the class, we're talking, like we said, travel, going to see and visit the kids, airplanes, bringing them and the family in for visits, wining and dining them, all that stuff that goes into it. Obviously, we're not talking about NIL deals and the such, but the nation's 4th biggest spender in recruiting happens to be ranked number 3 in the SEC. Tennessee Volunteers acquiring talent. They used an 11-win season to their advantage, got them one of the top quarterbacks in the country in Nico Iamaleava, and resulted in a top 10 class for Josh Heupel and company. Go Vols 24/7 said it was not entirely the case on Iamaleava's commitment to Tennessee being NIL-based. Obviously, he was sold on Josh Heupel's system, and we just saw Hendon Hooker have great success. It looks like Joe Milton is set up to have great success, and so it's all part of that. But nonetheless, Tennessee spending a lot of money on taking care of their recruiting. Number 3 on this list, I don't think anybody's going to be very surprised by this one, but it's Jimbo Fisher and the Texas A&M Aggies. They spent $3 million on their recruiting budget this past year, a year after signing the most talent-rich recruiting class in modern history. The Aggies signed another great recruiting class, finishing number 12 in the composite rankings, 6th in the SEC. But it was a big haul considering the Aggies had more transfer portal departures than any Power 5 program in the country. As Brad Crawford writes, he said the Aggies' efforts on the recruiting trail, a lot of it came after signing day, but he said it's an impact class in College Station and one the Aggies can stack on last year's elite haul. And Jimbo Fisher said during the early signing period, he felt immediate needs were addressed in several spots. Coming in at number 2 on this list was Clemson. We won't dive into them because, of course, they are the lone non-SEC team or future SEC team in the top of these rankings. But coming in at number 1, it's Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs. It was well documented. They spent more than anyone on recruiting budget this past year. $4.5 million they spent. And as Brad Crawford of 24/7 Sports writes, he said, big spending is nothing new for Georgia. They spent the most money recruiting out of every college football program during the last 4 non-COVID impacted recruiting cycles. Part of the reason Georgia's won back-to-back national titles under Kirby Smart. Last year at this time, the school reported they spent just under $6.3 million on recruiting for all the school's athletic programs. The Bulldogs spent $500,000 on men's basketball, $300,000 on women's basketball, and obviously spending the bulk of it on football. And so it is paying off. I mean, back-to-back national champs. We'll see if they can do it for a 3rd time in a row. But $4.5 million spent on their recruiting budget. in football just this past class alone. That is a lot of money, but you can't argue with the results. So we'll see. Some of the other schools in the SEC that did not make this list, LSU's, South Carolina's, are you willing to step up, pull a little bit more money in the budget? Maybe you will improve your recruiting like some of these schools did. But nonetheless, shout out to Brad Crawford. Encourage you guys to go to 24/7 Sports and read his stuff. All right, coming up next on Locked On SEC, we're going to dive into some of the names in the SEC basketball world that are either declaring for the draft or hitting the transfer portal. All that coming your way in just a sec. Along here, Locked On SEC, and I want to dive right back into it as we discuss some of the SEC basketball transfer portal news happening out there. And we start first with Kentucky. They are reportedly set to meet with former Michigan center Hunter Dickinson on Zoom this week. That is according to Jeff Goodman. He notes that Dickinson has been receiving interest from teams all over the country, and Kentucky is one of them. He surprisingly decided to enter his name into the transfer portal this offseason after finishing his third season at Michigan. He was a consensus All-American for the Wolverines as a sophomore 2 years ago. This past year, he scored 18.5 per game and grabbed a career-best 9 rebounds per contest. He's a 7-footer. Dickinson would presumably slide right in and replace Oscar Tshiebwe, who is yet to announce his plans, but expected to go pro. Kentucky did also just lose Ugonna Onyenso to the transfer portal on Wednesday. Damian Collins remains on the roster for now, but it's unclear what the rest of that roster is going to do. Yeah, losing Ugonna. We just talked with Coach Cal last weekend, and he seemed to think that Ugonna was going to stick around. He averaged just 2.5 points, 2.5 rebounds, and 1 block shot per game this past year, but nonetheless, Ugonna is on the move as well. Antonio Reeves was a key scorer and shooter for Kentucky this past year after transferring in from Illinois State. This week, he announced he is moving on, pursuing the NBA draft, but he will maintain his eligibility in the process. So I've determined that testing the waters and getting information back from the NBA is the best thing for me at this time. Always dreamt of being a pro basketball player, focused on fulfilling that dream. He was second on the team in points per game this year at 14.4 points per game. He was also the team's top 3-point shooting threat, shooting right around 40% from deep. So we'll see what happens with Antonio Reeves. And even if he decides to opt out of the NBA draft, will he stay at Kentucky? Will he hit the transfer portal? Would be a nice veteran piece for Cal next year. All right, other players going on around the conference. Vanderbilt center Quentin Milora-Brown announced Wednesday he will enter the transfer portal after spending 3 years in Nashville. Served as a backup for the Commodores when their starting center Liam Robbins had some injury issues. Milora-Brown averaged 3.5 points and 4 rebounds per game. He's the 6th Commodore to enter the portal. So a lot of turnover there for Jerry Stackhouse and his crew there in Vandy. Mizzou is reportedly one of the top teams still being considered by North Carolina guard transfer Caleb Love. Love is originally from the St. Louis area, entered the transfer portal this offseason, and On3 Sports reporting that Michigan keeps popping up in his interest. So we'll see where he ends up. Just finished his 3rd season in Chapel Hill. Shot well, under 40% from the floor, just under 30% from 3-point range, but Caleb Love on Missouri's radar. Meanwhile, Hofstra's Aaron Estrada entered the transfer portal early Tuesday, hearing from a lot of schools, and on his list includes SEC schools like Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas, and Ole Miss. All of them have already reached out, so keep an eye on Aaron Estrada from Hofstra. Could end up coming down to the SEC. He's the reigning CAA Player of the Year, averaged 20 points per game last season. Over in the AAC, Tremont Mark out of Houston, he is entering the transfer portal, and he's got a couple of SEC schools on his list, including Texas A&M, Arkansas, and Florida. Kansas State is the 4th other destination on the top of his list. So Tremont Mark, very likely going to end up playing the SEC next year. We'll see if it is A&M, Arkansas, or Florida Sounds like Arkansas has made the final list for every sought-after transfer prospect in the nation. They earned their first transfer commit a few days ago in Washington freshman Keon Menafield. He just chose Arkansas over the likes of Alabama, Tennessee, and Louisville. And big-time pickup there for Eric Musselman and crew. Meanwhile, Matthew Murrell over at Ole Miss announced this week he will be entering the NBA draft, will maintain the ability to return. Just going to check out his options. If he doesn't go to the draft, he'll have until May 31st to make a final decision. Spent the last 3 seasons in Oxford, his best year coming this past year. And we'll see what happens with Matthew Murrell. But Chris Beard taking over there, I'm sure he would like to have him back in the mix. Like we said, we mentioned Eric Musselman picked up Keon Menafield through the transfer portal from Washington. Ricky Council is entering the NBA draft. He announced that this week. The Razorback spent 1 season there at Arkansas, was a very productive one, scored 16 points per game this past year, got to the Sweet 16. He was a Wichita State transfer, and he is heading to the pros. Riley Kugel is returning to Florida next year. Could have opted to go pro, 6'5" shooting guard, had a very impressive freshman season, scored 9.9 points per game, shot 45% from the floor, has a lot of athleticism, made 37% of his three-point attempts, so that's a big time get back. Riley Kugel going back to Florida, along with Yale forward E.J. Jarvis coming in, so a good mix there for Florida. A couple more Vanderbilt people. Malik Dia, former Vanderbilt forward, he announced Monday he is transferring from Vanderbilt to Belmont, so he will stay in the state of Tennessee. Vanderbilt transfer Jordan Wright announced on Wednesday he has committed to LSU. The Baton Rouge native going to head back home for his final season. 10.5 points, 5 rebounds, and 2 assists per game last season for the Commodores. And so Vanderbilt transfer Jordan Wright going from Vandy to LSU. And one more basketball note, Auburn basketball will be heading back to the Maui Invitational in next year, 2024-2025. It was announced the field for the 2024 Maui Jim Maui Invitational. It'll be Auburn returning to the tournament for their second all-time appearance alongside Colorado, Dayton, Iowa State, Memphis, Michigan State, North Carolina, and reigning national champ UConn. So there you have it. That's your latest hoops news. And, man, there's a lot going on there with the transfer portal in basketball. I did want to make this note to you guys out there when it's concerned with the football transfer portal. Nicole Auerbach pointed this out on Wednesday. She said, FYI, the spring transfer window for college football is going to begin in just under 2 weeks, April 15th. She said, I'm not sure if everybody realized this, that it moved up, but the D1 Council's meeting in October, it was originally going to be May 1st through May 15th. They pushed it back to April 15th through the 30th. They said it will allow coaches and student athletes to have athletic participation conversations following spring football and before the start of summer athletics and summer school and all that kind of stuff. So that window's coming up very soon. So we're going to have some teams literally finishing with their spring game and then going to guys and going and say, hey, are you coming back? Are you entering the portal? We got to get an answer, because if not, we got to go hit the portal and we got to find some guys to replace you. So it's going to be a Wild Wild West. It's going to be nuts, and there's going to be a lot of movement. We'll keep you up to date on all of it. Thank you guys for making Locked On SEC your first listen every day. Now you go check out our second podcast, Locked On College Basketball. Everything you need to know about college hoops all in one place, recapping the season that was. Locked On College Basketball, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Chris Gordy. This has been Locked On SEC. We'll talk to you guys tomorrow.